The Dogman is the worst cryptid out there. The most dangerous, the most aggressive. Almost no one can survive such an encounter, no matter how strong or fast you are. Here's what I've learned that keeps me up at night. Bigfoot, for all the mystery surrounding it, exhibits behavior consistent with a reclusive primate. It avoids human contact, retreats when confronted, and shows patterns of fear-based responses. The Dogman is fundamentally different. Every credible account I've studied points to something with predatory intelligence, territorial aggression, and absolutely no fear of humans. Before we go further, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. Let me explain why the evidence suggests the Dogman represents a threat level that Bigfoot simply doesn't match. This isn't about which creature is real or which is stronger in some theoretical battle. This is about behavioral patterns, witness testimony consistency, and what the data tells us about each entity's relationship with human beings. Bigfoot encounters follow predictable patterns. Witnesses report seeing the creature at a distance, finding tracks, hearing vocalizations, or discovering evidence of its passage. In the rare instances of close encounters, Bigfoot consistently demonstrates avoidance behavior. It retreats into dense forest, creates distance, uses intimidation displays like tree knocking or rock throwing to encourage humans to leave its territory. The Dogman does not retreat. In account after account, witnesses describe the Dogman actively approaching them, studying them, following vehicles, circling campsites, and displaying what can only be described as hunting behavior. This is the critical distinction that makes the Dogman dangerous in ways that Bigfoot is not. Consider the fundamental differences in their ecological roles based on reported behavior. Bigfoot appears to fill a niche similar to great apes, living in small family groups, foraging for plant materials, occasionally hunting small game. The creature seems adapted for a lifestyle of concealment and avoidance, using its size and strength primarily for defense rather than predation. The Dogman, by all accounts, functions as an apex predator. It displays territorial behavior, marking and defending specific areas. It hunts actively rather than simply foraging. Its physical adaptations, from powerful jaws to sharp claws, are designed for taking down and consuming prey. This is not a creature that retreats from competition. This is a creature that eliminates it. The intelligence factor cannot be overstated. Bigfoot demonstrates problem-solving ability and social organization, traits consistent with primate cognition. The Dogman's intelligence appears to manifest in different ways. It understands human technology well enough to interact with it. It recognizes vehicles as mobile shelters and seems to test them for vulnerabilities. It uses tactics that suggest long-term observation of human behavior. One researcher I interviewed, a retired wildlife biologist who spent 4 decades studying wolf behavior, provided fascinating insight. He analyzed dozens of Dogman encounter reports without knowing what creature they described. His conclusion was chilling. The behavioral patterns suggested a predator with wolf-like pack intelligence, combined with primate-level tool use concepts and planning ability. My research began with the Michigan folklore, the epicenter of modern Dogman reports. The first documented modern encounter occurred in 1887 in Wexford County when 2 lumberjacks described a creature with a man's body and a dog's head. But the legend exploded in 1987 when a radio DJ named Steve Cook wrote a song called The Legend as an April Fool's prank. Cook intended it as entertainment, pulling together various folklore elements to create an original myth. What happened next shocked him. The station received dozens of calls from listeners claiming they had encountered exactly what the song described. Cook has since received hundreds of reports, all remarkably consistent in their descriptions of a 7-foot-tall bipedal canine with amber or blue eyes. I traveled to Michigan's Lower Peninsula to investigate these reports firsthand. The concentration of sightings in the northwestern quadrant, particularly around Manistee National Forest, suggested either a localized phenomenon or a very effective rumor mill. What I found convinced me that something genuine underlies these accounts. I spent weeks interviewing witnesses who had no connection to each other, no exposure to popular Dogman media, and in several cases no knowledge of the broader legend until their own encounter. Their descriptions aligned with disturbing precision. a large canine head with intelligent eyes, a muscular bipedal body covered in dark fur, long arms ending in clawed hands, and movement that combined the grace of a predator with deliberate, calculated behavior. One encounter particularly stood out in my research. I interviewed a former park ranger who had worked in the Manistee area for over 15 years. He agreed to speak with me only on condition of anonymity, concerned about professional reputation and the ridicule that follows these reports. His account was methodical, detailed, and deeply unsettling. In October of 2019, he was conducting a routine patrol on a service road deep in the national forest. It was late afternoon, that golden hour before sunset when visibility is still good, but shadows grow long. He rounded a bend and saw something standing in the middle of the road about 50 yards ahead. His first thought was that someone had brought a horse onto the trail, which sometimes happened despite regulations. Then the figure turned to face his vehicle, and he saw it was not a horse. It stood upright on two legs, easily 7 feet tall, with a wolf-like head and shoulders far too broad for any natural canine. The dogman stared directly at his vehicle. The ranger described the eyes as amber-colored, catching the afternoon light and reflecting it back. There was no hesitation in the creature's posture, no startled response, no preparation to flee. It simply stood there, watching him with what he described as unmistakable intelligence. He sat in his truck with his foot on the brake, engine running, trying to process what he was seeing. The dogman dropped to all fours with a fluid motion that reminded him of a wolf, but its shoulders and front legs were too long, too powerful. It moved to the side of the road without taking its eyes off the vehicle. Then it did something that convinced him this was no ordinary animal. The dogman circled behind a large pine tree, maintaining visual contact the entire time. It positioned itself so the tree trunk partially obscured its body while keeping its head visible, peering around the bark at him. That behavior, the ranger told me, was predatory reconnaissance. Not fear, not confusion, but a calculated assessment of a potential threat or prey. The dogman was using cover while maintaining observation, exactly the way a human hunter might approach unknown prey or a wolf pack might study a herd before selecting a target. The ranger did what training suggested. He turned on his lights, activated his siren briefly, and slowly advanced the vehicle. The dogman watched him approach to within 30 yards, then stood upright again. In one smooth motion, it stepped back into the forest and vanished into the undergrowth without sound. What disturbed him most wasn't the sighting itself, but what happened afterward. He reported the incident to his supervisor, who told him to file it as a possible wolf sighting and say nothing more. 2 days later, he was approached by 2 individuals who identified themselves as wildlife consultants. They asked him detailed questions about the sighting. They wanted to know exact times, locations, weather conditions, and whether he had taken any photographs or video. When he mentioned the creature's bipedal stance and intelligent behavior, they exchanged glances but wrote nothing down. They thanked him for his time and left. The ranger checked with his supervisor afterward. Nobody had authorized any wildlife consultants to interview park staff. Nobody had any record of who these individuals were or what agency they represented. The supervisor told him to drop it and get back to work. This pattern of official discouragement appears repeatedly in Dogman reports. Witnesses are told they saw a bear, a wolf, a dog, anything but what they actually observed. In cases where the encounter was particularly credible or involved multiple witnesses, there are often reports of unofficial interviews by unidentified individuals, followed by suggestions that discussing the incident further would be unwise. My investigation took me next to Wisconsin, where the Beast of Bray Road represents another concentration of dogman activity. The rural roads around Elkhorn became the center of national attention in the early 1990s, when journalist Linda Godfrey began documenting sightings reported to local law enforcement. I met with Godfrey during my research, and she shared her extensive files on Wisconsin encounters. What struck me immediately was the consistency of behavioral patterns. Unlike Bigfoot sightings, which often involve brief glimpses or distant observations, dogman encounters frequently involve prolonged interaction and deliberate pursuit. One Wisconsin case from 1989 particularly exemplifies the predatory intelligence I'm describing. A woman was driving home late at night on a rural road near Elkhorn. She noticed something kneeling by the roadside, hunched over what appeared to be roadkill. As her headlights illuminated the figure, it stood up. She described a creature well over 6 feet tall with the head of a wolf, standing perfectly balanced on 2 legs. It was covered in dark fur and had long arms that ended in what she clearly saw were hands, not paws, with visible claws. The Dogman turned its head to look directly at her vehicle. She described the eyes as reflecting her headlights with an amber glow, and the expression on its face as unmistakably intelligent. It wasn't the blank stare of an animal caught in headlights, but focused attention, as if it were processing her presence and making decisions. She accelerated past it, her heart racing, trying to convince herself she had misidentified what she saw. Then she glanced in her rearview mirror. The Dogman was running after her vehicle, moving on all fours with incredible speed. It kept pace with her car for several hundred yards before breaking off the pursuit and disappearing into the tree line. This is not avoidance behavior. This is not an animal startled by human presence. This is a predator evaluating prey and making the calculated decision to pursue. The fact that it broke off the chase rather than continuing suggests intelligence enough to assess that the vehicle represented superior speed and safety for its target. I interviewed the woman myself decades after her encounter. She's now in her 60s, a grandmother, a retired nurse, with a reputation for level-headed common sense. She told me that what disturbed her most wasn't the chase itself, but the look on the Dogman's face when it first turned toward her. She described an expression of recognition, as if the Dogman knew exactly what she was and what a vehicle represented. There was no confusion, no animal curiosity, just cold assessment. When it started running after her car, she said it reminded her of videos she'd seen of cheetahs chasing prey. The movement was fluid, purposeful, and terrifyingly fast for something so large. What she remembered most vividly was the moment it stopped chasing her. The Dogman didn't slow down gradually or seem to lose interest. It simply stopped, stood upright on its hind legs again, and watched her taillights disappear down the road. She glanced back one last time before rounding a curve and saw it standing there in the middle of the road, perfectly still, watching her go. That deliberate disengagement has stuck with her for over 3 decades. She's convinced the Dogman chose to let her go, that it could have continued the pursuit, but decided she wasn't worth the effort. That realization, that she survived not through her own actions, but because something chose to allow it, has haunted her ever since. Another Wisconsin encounter I investigated involved the experienced outdoorsman who spent over 40 years hunting and fishing throughout the state. He was bow hunting for deer in late October, positioned in a tree stand about 15 feet off the ground in dense forest near Bray Road. He'd been in position since before dawn, completely still, watching a game trail below. Around mid-morning, he heard something large moving through the forest. His first thought was another hunter, but the movement was wrong, too heavy, too deliberate. He remained motionless, watching through the trees. What emerged onto the trail was no hunter. The Dogman walked on 2 legs with a gait that reminded him of a human hiker, but the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too broad through the shoulders, with arms that hung longer than human arms should. The head was unmistakably canine, though larger than any wolf or dog he'd ever seen. The Dogman stopped directly below his tree stand. It stood there, not moving, for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a minute or 2. Then it did something that made his blood run cold. The Dogman looked up, not randomly scanning the canopy, but looking directly at him, making eye contact. He told me he's never been more certain of anything in his life. The Dogman knew he was there. It had known all along. It walked onto that trail, positioned itself below his stand, and looked up at him with full knowledge of his presence. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, just locked eyes with something that shouldn't exist. After holding eye contact for several seconds, the Dogman did something even more disturbing. It dropped to all fours, circled the base of the tree once, then returned to the trail and continued walking as if nothing had happened. It moved off into the forest and disappeared. The hunter stayed in that tree stand for another 3 hours, too terrified to climb down. When he finally descended, he found tracks in the soft ground around the tree base. Large canine prints, but with an unusual toe spread and depth that suggested significant weight. The tracks confirmed what he already knew. Something had deliberately circled his position, marking its awareness of him. He never hunted in that area again. He told me that in 40 years of wilderness experience, he'd dealt with every dangerous animal in Wisconsin. Black bears, aggressive bucks during rut, even a close encounter with a timber wolf. None of those experiences compared to looking into the eyes of the Dogman and recognizing intelligence looking back at him. Godfrey documented dozens of similar encounters throughout the 1990s and 2000s. Drivers reporting Dogman figures watching from the roadside, campers describing circling behavior around their sites, hunters finding themselves being tracked through the woods by something that moved with purpose and intelligence. What makes these Wisconsin accounts particularly credible is the diversity of witnesses. Law enforcement officers, county officials, longtime hunters with extensive wildlife experience, professionals with no interest in publicity or cryptozoology. These are not people seeking attention or caught up in local folklore. Many of them reported their encounters reluctantly, only after being assured of anonymity. The behavioral patterns that emerge from these accounts are consistent and distinct from any known animal. The Dogman appears to be primarily nocturnal or crepuscular, most active during twilight hours and at night. It demonstrates no fear of human structures or technology, approaching vehicles, buildings, and campsites with apparent curiosity or territorial assertion. It uses bipedal locomotion as its primary mode of movement, switching to quadrupedal running for speed. This versatility gives it both the height advantage of human sightlines and the speed of a four-legged predator. Multiple witnesses describe its gait as fluid and natural, not awkward or forced, suggesting this is not an animal standing upright, but something adapted for bipedal movement. The Dogman's vocalizations distinguish it from both wolves and Bigfoot. Witnesses describe howls that sound partially human, as if a human voice and wolf howl were merged. There are reports of screaming that sounds like a woman or child in distress, a tactic common to mountain lions, but disturbing in its apparent deliberateness when attributed to the Dogman. Most significantly, the Dogman demonstrates what researchers call human pantomime, making gestures and movements that suggest communication attempts or mimicry of human behavior. Witnesses report seeing the Dogman point, wave, or make head gestures that appear to convey meaning. This is not typical animal behavior and suggests cognitive complexity beyond simple instinct. My research led me next to the land between the lakes, a recreation area straddling the Kentucky-Tennessee border. This location has become notorious in cryptid circles for what some call the LBL massacre, an incident alleged to have occurred in the early 1980s involving a family camping in the area. The story goes that a family of 4 was found in their RV, the victims of what was officially classified as an animal attack. According to unofficial accounts from first responders, the scene was unlike anything they had encountered. The victims showed signs of attack by something with extraordinary strength and teeth and claws that exceeded any known predator in the region. I cannot verify the massacre story through official channels. No police reports are publicly available, and law enforcement officials I contacted either had no knowledge of such an incident or declined to discuss it. However, I did find multiple references to a family attack in the land between the lakes during that time period in local newspaper archives, though the articles provided few details. What I can verify is the remarkable number of Dogman sightings reported from the land between the lakes over the past 4 decades. I interviewed over a dozen witnesses who claimed encounters in the area, and their descriptions align perfectly with Michigan and Wisconsin reports. One account came from a group of college students who camped in the land between the lakes in the late 1990s. 4 young men, all in their early 20s, drove in Friday evening for a weekend of hiking and camping. They set up their tents near a creek, built a fire, and spent the evening enjoying typical camping activities. Around midnight, one of them left the fire to relieve himself in the woods. He was gone less than 5 minutes when he returned to the campsite, pale and shaking. He told his friends he heard something moving in the darkness, circling him while he was vulnerable. He described heavy breathing and the sound of something large moving through brush with deliberate, careful steps. His friends initially dismissed his concern as nerves or wildlife. Then they all heard it, a low growl that came from the tree line beyond their firelight. The sound was deep enough to feel in their chests, sustained and resonant. It didn't sound like any dog or coyote. One of them, a biology major with wildlife experience, said it reminded him of a wolf but larger, with a quality that made his skin crawl. The growl moved around their campsite, circling from right to left. They could hear undergrowth disturbing as something large passed through it, staying just beyond the reach of their flashlight beams. The movement was too controlled, too deliberate to be random animal behavior. Whatever was out there was actively circling their position. They grabbed flashlights and tried to illuminate what was making the sounds. They caught glimpses of something moving between trees, something upright and massive. One of them swore he saw eyes reflecting their flashlight, positioned too high off the ground to be any normal animal. The circling continued for over an hour. The Dogman, if that's what it was, never approached within the firelight, but maintained its perimeter patrol of their campsite. The students sat around their fire, weapons in hand, rocks and camping equipment ready, waiting for whatever would happen next. Around 2 a.m, the sounds stopped. The forest went silent in that oppressive way that signals predator presence. They waited, listening, hearing nothing but the crackle of their fire. Finally, as dawn began to lighten the sky, they heard something moving away through the forest, heavy footfalls that gradually faded into the distance. They packed up their campsite as soon as there was enough light to see, abandoning their plans for a weekend camping trip. When they returned to their vehicles, they found deep scratches on one of the car hoods, 4 parallel gouges that looked like they had been made by large claws. This pattern of behavior, the prolonged stalking, the circling, the psychological intimidation, appears repeatedly in Dogman accounts. It's not the behavior of an animal defending territory or investigating something unusual. It's predatory behavior with an element of psychological manipulation that suggests intelligence and intent. I tracked down 3 of those 4 college students to interview them personally. Now in their 40s, established in careers and family life, they had no reason to maintain a false story from their youth. All 3 confirmed the basic details and added information that made the encounter even more disturbing. One of them, who became a software engineer, told me about something that happened before the circling began. Earlier that evening, before they even heard the growling, he had walked to the creek to refill their water bottles. While crouched by the water, he heard branches breaking in the forest across the creek. He looked up and saw something moving between the trees. Just a glimpse, a shape that seemed too tall and wrong to be a bear or deer. He told his friends about it when he returned to camp, but they dismissed it as a trick of the shadows. Now, looking back, he's convinced the Dogman was already watching them before nightfall, that it had been stalking their campsite from the moment they arrived. The second student I interviewed, now a high school teacher, shared something he hadn't told even his camping companions that night. During the prolonged circling, he thought he saw 2 different shapes moving in the darkness. At one point, he caught a glimpse of eyes reflecting their flashlight beam from one direction, while sounds of movement came from a completely different area. He'd kept quiet about this observation because it seemed impossible. But after years of reflection and learning about pack predator behavior, he wondered if there had been multiple Dogman creatures working together, coordinating their movements to keep the group pinned and frightened. This possibility, that Dogman might hunt in packs or family groups, makes the danger profile exponentially worse. The third student, who became a paramedic, told me the encounter fundamentally changed his relationship with wilderness. Before that night, he loved camping and spent every free weekend in state parks. After that night, he's never slept in a tent again. He still goes outdoors, but only for day trips, and he's never comfortable in dense forest. He described the psychological impact of being watched and circled by something you can't clearly see, but know is there. It's not like being startled by wildlife or even the adrenaline of spotting a bear. It's the slow realization that you're being evaluated, tested, possibly selected as prey, That feeling, he said, never completely goes away. What struck me about all 3 interviews was their certainty. These weren't people embellishing a story for attention or misremembering events from their youth. They could describe that night in vivid detail, down to the temperature, the smell of their campfire, the exact position of the moon. Traumatic memories stay fresh in ways that normal experiences don't. During my time investigating land between the lakes encounters, I also spoke with a park maintenance worker who asked to remain anonymous. He's been employed there for over 20 years and has heard stories from rangers, campground hosts, and other workers that never make it into official reports. According to him, there's an unofficial protocol among longtime park staff. Certain areas are avoided after dark. Certain trails are checked only in pairs and never late in the day. New employees are told these precautions are because of wildlife, but veteran workers know it's specifically because of something else, something that's been reported consistently enough to warrant genuine caution. He told me about a pattern of missing pets from the residential areas bordering the park. Dogs disappear from fenced yards, sometimes leaving scratch marks on fence posts or torn sections of chain link. Cats vanish in the night. The official explanation is usually coyotes or wild dogs, but some of the fencing damage suggests something larger and stronger than coyotes could produce. There are also reports, unverified but persistent, of livestock kills on nearby farms. Cattle found with their throats torn out, sheep dragged away from locked pens, damage to outbuildings that suggests something was trying to get inside. Farmers don't report these incidents officially because they know they'll be told it was coyotes or feral dogs. But the farmers know their local predators, and this isn't that. The maintenance worker shared one particularly disturbing account from a colleague who no longer works at the park. This colleague was doing early morning trash collection at a remote campground. It was just after dawn, light enough to see but still quiet and empty. As he drove his truck between campsites, he noticed something standing at the edge of the tree line. At first glance, he thought it was a person, maybe an early morning hiker. Then he realized it was too tall, and the proportions were wrong. The figure stood completely still, watching him work. He continued his route, checking trash cans and collecting bags, trying to act normal while his heart pounded. Every time he looked toward the tree line, the figure was still there, tracking his movement, rotating to keep him in sight. He described it as having a wolf-like head and being covered in dark fur that looked matted or wet. When he finished the campground loop and drove back toward the entrance, the figure was gone. He searched the area with his truck, circling back, but found nothing. No tracks in the morning dew, no disturbance in the underbrush, nothing to indicate what he'd seen or where it had gone. That worker finished his shift, turned in his resignation that afternoon, and never returned. The maintenance worker told me this wasn't an isolated case. Staff turnover at certain positions is higher than others, particularly jobs that require being alone in remote areas before dawn or after dusk. People don't always say why they're leaving, but the pattern is clear to those who've been there long enough to notice. Compare this to typical Bigfoot encounters. Researchers in that field describe Bigfoot as shy and reclusive, avoiding human contact whenever possible. When cornered or surprised, Bigfoot demonstrates intimidation displays, making itself appear larger, vocalizing aggressively, throwing objects to encourage the human to leave. But it doesn't stalk, doesn't circle, doesn't engage in the prolonged psychological intimidation that characterizes Dogman encounters. I want to share one more encounter that exemplifies the unique danger profile of the Dogman. This account comes from a truck driver who was making a late-night delivery through rural Michigan in the summer of 2016. He was driving a route he'd traveled hundreds of times through heavily forested areas with few towns or services. Around 3 a.m, he noticed something running parallel to his truck through the trees. At first he thought it might be a deer, but it was keeping pace with him despite his speed of about 55 miles per hour. As he watched through the passenger window, he could make out a large shape moving through the forest, weaving between trees with remarkable agility. Then the figure broke out of the tree line and ran across the road directly in front of his truck. He slammed on the brakes, the trailer fishtailing behind him, but the creature had already crossed and disappeared into the forest on the opposite side. In the brief moment illuminated by his headlights, he saw it clearly. The Dogman ran on all 4 legs like a wolf, but its front limbs were longer and more heavily muscled than any canine's should be. Its back legs were powerful and digitigrade, meaning it ran on its toes like a dog or wolf. But the head was wrong, too large, too intelligent looking. The creature was massive, easily the size of a large bear, but built completely differently. What happened next convinced him this was no ordinary animal. After the dogmen crossed the road, the truck driver pulled over, shaking with adrenaline. He sat there for a few minutes trying to process what he'd seen. Then he heard a sound that made him lock his doors and consider abandoning the truck altogether. From the forest came a howl unlike anything he'd ever heard. It started low and guttural, like a wolf howl, but then rose in pitch and took on an almost human quality, as if someone was imitating a wolf, but couldn't quite get it right. The sound was answered from deeper in the forest by another howl, and then another. 3 distinct voices, all producing that same disturbing half-canine, half-human vocalization. The truck driver told me he grew up in rural Michigan and had heard wolves, coyotes, and every other animal that inhabits the northern forests. This was none of those things. The howls had an intentional quality, as if they were communicating specific information rather than just making noise. And the way they were answered and coordinated suggested organization. He sat in his cab with the engine running, listening to these howls echoing back and forth across the forest for nearly 10 minutes. Then, as suddenly as they started, they stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the howling. He waited another 20 minutes before he felt safe enough to continue his route. When I interviewed him, he showed me the dashcam footage from that night. The video quality wasn't good enough to make out clear details of the creature crossing the road, but you could see a large, dark shape moving with incredible speed. More importantly, the audio captured those howls. I've listened to that recording dozens of times, compared it to known wolf and coyote vocalizations, consulted with wildlife audio specialists. The consensus was disturbing. The vocalizations contained elements of canine howling, but with tonal variations and rhythmic patterns that don't match any known North American canid. One specialist told me it sounded like someone was trying to imitate a wolf, but adding their own variations. The coordination between the 3 different howls suggested communication, possibly location sharing or pack coordination. This encounter illustrates several key aspects of Dogman behavior that distinguish it from Bigfoot and elevate the danger level. First, the Dogman demonstrated sustained pursuit, pacing the truck for some distance before crossing the road. This wasn't a chance encounter, but deliberate shadowing behavior. Second, the coordinated howling suggests multiple Dogman creatures working together, or at least communicating across distances. This pack behavior, if accurate, means encounters might not involve a single creature, but multiple individuals acting in concert. That multiplies the danger exponentially. Third, the Dogman showed no fear of the large, loud, well-lit truck. It crossed directly in the vehicle's path at high speed, demonstrating either complete confidence in its own abilities or lack of understanding that the truck represented potential danger. Either interpretation is concerning. The Dogman appears to understand human psychology in disturbing ways. It uses darkness and sound to maximum psychological effect. It approaches close enough to be threatening, but often stays just out of clear visual range. It demonstrates behavior that suggests it enjoys the fear response, the way a predator might toy with prey before making a final move. I've studied predator behavior extensively in my research. Wolves, bears, mountain lions, all the major North American predators exhibit recognizable patterns. The Dogman's behavior matches predatory patterns, but with additions that suggest planning, decision-making, and manipulation beyond typical animal intelligence. During my time in the land between the lakes, I spoke with park rangers, local hunters, and residents who live near the recreation area. Almost everyone I interviewed had either experienced something unusual themselves or knew someone who had. The consistent thread in their stories was the sense of being watched, the feeling that something intelligent was observing them from the forest. One hunter described finding a deer carcass that had been torn apart with extraordinary force. The deer's ribcage was crushed, the body positioned in a way that suggested it had been carried a significant distance before being consumed. The pattern of consumption was unusual, methodical, different from how bears or coyotes feed on carrion. What concerned him most was what he found near the carcass. Paw prints, but not quite right. They showed claw marks like a large canine, but the pad structure was wrong. The prints suggested a weight distribution more like human footprints than dog or wolf tracks. Some prints showed all 4 limbs on the ground, others only 2, as if whatever made them had switched between quadrupedal and bipedal movement. He followed the trail of prints for several hundred yards before they disappeared onto rocky ground. At one point, the prints stopped at a large tree. He found scratch marks on the bark, high up, at least 8 feet off the ground. The marks were deep, made by something with significant strength and sharp claws. That hunter has over 30 years of experience in those woods. He knows what bear sign looks like, understands wolf behavior, can identify tracks and scat from every animal in the region. He told me flatly that what he found that day was none of those things. It was something else, something that didn't fit any category he knew. The accumulation of these accounts, the consistency across geographic regions and time periods, the credibility of many witnesses, all point towards something genuine underlying the Dogman phenomenon. Whether it's an unknown species, a rare cryptid population, or something else entirely, the evidence suggests this is not simple folklore or misidentification. Now let me explain why this makes the Dogman more dangerous than Bigfoot. Danger comes not just from physical capability, but from behavior, intent, and the relationship between the entity and human beings. Bigfoot in most encounters wants nothing to do with humans. It retreats, it hides. It uses vast wilderness areas to maintain distance from human populations. The rare aggressive Bigfoot encounters typically involve surprise, territorial defense, or protection of young. These are understandable, predictable animal responses. The Dogman actively engages with humans. It approaches vehicles, investigates campsites, follows individuals through the forest. This behavior suggests curiosity, but it also suggests something more troubling. The Dogman appears to view humans as interesting, perhaps as potential prey, possibly as rivals in shared territory. Multiple researchers have noted that Dogman sightings cluster around areas of human activity: roads, campgrounds, hiking trails, residential areas near forests. This is the opposite of Bigfoot patterns, which concentrate in remote wilderness far from human habitation. The Dogman seems drawn to the interface between human civilization and wild spaces. This brings me to one of the most disturbing aspects of my research. In numerous accounts, witnesses describe the Dogman's eyes with consistent details about the intelligence and malevolence they perceive there. This is subjective, I recognize, but the frequency and consistency of this description suggests something worth noting. People who encounter Bigfoot often describe it as wary, curious, or indifferent. Those who encounter the Dogman describe eyes that convey hatred, predatory interest, or a calculating intelligence that makes them feel like prey being evaluated. This perception, whether accurate or not, creates a psychological dimension to Dogman encounters that exceeds typical wildlife experiences. The Dogman's apparent lack of fear regarding humans is another concerning factor. Bears can be conditioned to avoid humans through negative reinforcement. Wolves naturally maintain distance from human populations. Mountain lions, despite being apex predators, typically retreat when confronted by humans. The Dogman, according to witness accounts, shows no such fear response. It stands its ground when discovered, sometimes advances toward humans, and in several reports appears to deliberately reveal itself as if asserting dominance or making its presence known. There are documented cases of Dogman approaching occupied vehicles, looking through windows, even scratching on doors or vehicle exteriors. This is not normal predator behavior. Natural predators avoid enclosed humans in vehicles, recognizing them as dangerous or unapproachable. The Dogman's willingness to approach and investigate vehicles suggests either unfamiliarity with human technology or complete confidence in its own superiority. The reports of Dogman vocalizations add another layer of concern. While Bigfoot is famous for whoops, howls, and wood knocks, these sound like animal communications. The Dogman's vocalizations are described as disturbing, specifically because they sound partly human. Witnesses report hearing screams that sound like a person in distress, growls that contain almost word-like qualities, howls that seem to convey intention or emotion beyond simple animal calls. Some researchers have suggested the Dogman might be using these vocalizations deliberately to unsettle humans or possibly to lure people toward the source of the sound. This would represent a level of manipulation and understanding of human psychology that exceeds anything documented in known animal behavior. The physical descriptions of the Dogman also suggest greater danger potential than Bigfoot. While Bigfoot is generally described as large and powerful, it lacks the natural weapons that the Dogman possesses. The Dogman has powerful jaws filled with large teeth designed for tearing and crushing. It has clawed hands capable of inflicting severe injuries. Its combination of size, strength, speed, and natural weaponry makes it formidable in ways that Bigfoot is not. Bigfoot, despite its size advantage, appears to be primarily herbivorous or omnivorous based on the limited evidence available. The Dogman, with its canine features and predatory behavior, is clearly carnivorous. This fundamental difference in diet and hunting behavior creates different threat profiles. During my research, I consulted with wildlife biologists and predator behavior specialists. I described the Dogman accounts without mentioning the cryptid angle, simply presenting them as reports of an unknown predator. The consensus was disturbing. The behavioral patterns I described matched those of apex predators with no natural enemies and significant hunting capability. One biologist pointed out that the stalking and circling behavior, combined with the apparent psychological intimidation, suggested a predator that doesn't need to rely solely on physical ambush. It can afford to announce its presence because it's confident in its ability to overcome prey, even when that prey is alert and defensive. This confidence is what separates dangerous predators from merely powerful ones. A grizzly bear will typically bluff charge and retreat if the target stands its ground. A mountain lion will almost always flee if confronted aggressively. These predators have instincts that tell them humans might be dangerous, that injury is not worth the meal. The Dogman, if witness accounts are accurate, shows no such calculation. It stands its ground, maintains eye contact, sometimes advances. This suggests either it has no experience with humans as threats, or it has had experience and concluded humans pose no significant danger to it. I need to address the obvious skepticism that surrounds these claims. I started this research as a skeptic myself. I've investigated dozens of supposed cryptid sightings that turned out to be misidentifications, hoaxes, or simple mistakes. I understand the tendency to dismiss extraordinary claims, but the Dogman phenomenon has several elements that make it harder to dismiss than typical cryptid reports. The consistency of descriptions across different regions and time periods, the diversity of witnesses, including law enforcement, military personnel, wildlife professionals, the behavioral patterns that are specific and detailed rather than vague, the physical evidence, while limited, that includes photographs, video footage, and trackcasts that are difficult to explain as known animals. Most significantly, the Dogman reports come from people who often don't want to report what they've seen. They fear ridicule, professional consequences, and the stigma attached to cryptid encounters. These are not attention seekers or folklore enthusiasts. They are people who saw something that disturbed them enough to risk reputation and credibility to report it. My conclusion, after 3 years of investigation, is that something unknown is being encountered in the forests of North America. Whether it's a flesh and blood animal, an undiscovered species, or something else entirely, I cannot say with certainty. But the evidence suggests it exhibits predatory behavior toward humans in ways that Bigfoot does not. The Dogman appears to be territorial in areas that overlap with human recreation and habitation. It demonstrates curiosity about humans that manifests as stalking and surveillance rather than avoidance. It shows no fear of human technology or defensive postures. It possesses physical capabilities that make it extremely dangerous if it chose to attack. Most importantly, the Dogman demonstrates behavior that suggests intelligence, planning, and possibly an understanding of human psychology. This combination of traits, intelligence coupled with predatory capability and apparent willingness to interact with humans, creates a danger profile that exceeds Bigfoot in practically every category. I'm not suggesting people should live in fear or avoid wilderness areas. The vast majority of people who camp, hike, and recreate in forests will never encounter anything unusual. But for those who do venture into areas with documented Dogman activity, awareness is crucial. The recommendations that work for avoiding bear encounters or mountain lion attacks may not apply to the dogman. Making noise, traveling in groups, carrying bear spray, these are sensible precautions, but may not deter an entity that shows no fear of humans and possibly views them with predatory interest. Based on the accounts I've studied, if you encounter the dogman, the best response is to leave the area immediately. Don't investigate. Don't try to get a better look. Don't attempt to document the encounter. Get to your vehicle or other secure location as quickly as possible, while maintaining awareness of your surroundings. The dogman's intelligence means that typical animal deterrence might not work. It may recognize that you are trying to intimidate it and respond accordingly. The accounts where people successfully escaped dogman encounters typically involve immediate retreat rather than confrontation. I want to emphasize that I have not found any verified cases of fatal dogman attacks in my research. The alleged LBL massacre remains unverified. Most dogman encounters end with the creature withdrawing or the witness fleeing. This suggests the dogman, whatever it is not actively hunting humans for food. However, the absence of verified attacks doesn't mean the danger is imaginary. It may simply mean the dogman chooses not to attack, or that attacks have been misclassified as animal attacks by known predators, or that victims of attacks did not survive to report them. The question of why the dogman hasn't been officially documented by science is complex. If we assume the creature exists, several factors could explain the lack of scientific recognition. It may have a very small population scattered across vast wilderness areas. It may be primarily nocturnal and extremely reclusive despite occasional human encounters. It may possess intelligence enough to actively avoid documentation. There's also the institutional resistance to cryptid recognition. Scientists stake their reputations on published research and peer review. Pursuing a creature that mainstream science considers folklore would be career suicide for most researchers. The few who have investigated the dogman seriously tend to be retired professionals, independent researchers, or individuals working outside academic institutions. Financial considerations also play a role. Research requires funding, and funding agencies are unlikely to support investigation of an unrecognized cryptid. Without funding, comprehensive scientific study becomes nearly impossible. The research that does occur is typically done by dedicated individuals working with limited resources and personal investment. Government response to dogman reports adds another layer of complexity. The pattern of official discouragement, the unofficial interviews by unidentified individuals, the classification of credible sightings as misidentifications, all suggest either deliberate suppression or institutional unwillingness to acknowledge something that doesn't fit established wildlife categories. Whether this represents a conspiracy to hide the truth or simply bureaucratic resistance to the unexplained, I cannot determine. What's clear is that witnesses who report to official channels are typically told they saw something mundane and should not pursue the matter further. So why do I believe the dogman is more dangerous than Bigfoot? It comes down to behavior and intent. Bigfoot wants to be left alone. The dogman appears interested in humans in ways that suggest evaluation, territorial assertion, or predatory curiosity. Bigfoot retreats from confrontation. The dogman engages, observes, sometimes pursues. Bigfoot sightings occur in remote wilderness. Dogman encounters happen near human activity, suggesting either adaptation to human presence or deliberate choice to interact with the human world. Bigfoot demonstrates animal intelligence focused on survival and avoidance. The dogman shows cognitive capability that includes planning, manipulation, and possibly communication. The combination of these factors creates a threat profile unique among reported cryptids. If the dogman exists as described by witnesses, it represents an apex predator with intelligence approaching or possibly exceeding that of great apes, physical capabilities that match or exceed large canine predators, and a behavioral pattern that includes human interaction rather than avoidance. My research has convinced me that something is being encountered in North American forests that defies conventional explanation. Whether future investigation will prove the dogman to be an unknown species, a rare cryptid population, or something else entirely remains to be seen. What I can say with certainty is that the witnesses I've interviewed are credible, their accounts are consistent, and the behavioral patterns they describe suggest an entity that should be taken seriously from a safety perspective. The Dogman, if it exists, is not a shy forest creature avoiding human contact. It is an intelligent, capable predator that shows interest in humans and demonstrates no fear of interaction. That is why I believe the Dogman is the most dangerous cryptid, more so than Bigfoot or any other reported unknown creature in North America. Not because it's necessarily more physically powerful, though it may be, but because its behavior suggests it views humans as something worth investigating, testing, possibly hunting. In the hierarchy of danger, the most dangerous predator is not the biggest or strongest, but the one that has lost its fear of humans and developed strategies for dealing with human defenses. The accounts I've studied suggest that Dogman fits this profile in disturbing ways. I continue my research, interviewing new witnesses, visiting encounter sites, studying physical evidence when available. Each new account reinforces the patterns I've already identified while occasionally adding new details that make the picture more complex. The Dogman remains elusive, photographed rarely and always at distance or in conditions that make clear documentation impossible. Whether this is intentional behavior or simply the result of its nocturnal nature and forest habitat is impossible to say. What I do know is that hundreds, possibly thousands of people across North America have reported encounters with something that matches the Dogman description. These reports span decades, cross geographic boundaries, and come from witnesses who had no knowledge of each other's experiences. The consistency of these independent accounts suggests something real underlies the phenomenon. Whether that something is a flesh and blood creature, an undiscovered species maintaining a hidden population, or something beyond current biological understanding, remains the great question. For now, I can only present the evidence as I've found it, and encourage people to approach wilderness areas with appropriate awareness. The Dogman, if it exists as described, represents a reminder that our understanding of the natural world is incomplete, and that some mysteries remain unsolved in the deep forests of North America. Stay safe out there. Pay attention to your instincts. And if you encounter something that doesn't match any animal you know, trust your judgment and remove yourself from the situation. The woods hold secrets we're only beginning to understand, and the Dogman may be among the most significant and dangerous of those mysteries. For more stories like this, please consider subscribing.